Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for another installment of the Timestream Chronicles. And a special early hello to all of my patrons supporting me on Patreon. Thank you very much for your support. It means a lot to me. In the previous installment of this series, we saw it end with Urza angrily leaving the Drake's lair with Karn sadly in tow, as the Drake had absolutely refused to obey Urza. Now, in this next portion of the story, we find ourselves with Baron, as he is half panicking, seeking escape, running through a forest, smashing through underbrush, branches snagging on his clothing. Now, normally he's a more composed individual, but it's difficult to maintain your composure when you're being chased by a massive python. This beast's head, it's a giant horned head, was as big as Baron. This thing could easily swallow him whole, as evidenced by the fact that there were two people who had already been swallowed by this beast. Two man-sized lumps were very evident, one of which was still moving around inside of the python. Now, this was terrifying to Baron. He was racking his brain for a spell to deal with this. He is pounding his way through the forest, trying to escape, half frazzled. Basically, what happened to him, this python managed to surprise him when he was in a battle with a bunch of Phyrexians. So he was essentially interrupted during the casting of a very complex spell. As a result, the mana recoiled on him and burned through his body. Now, this led to him being frazzled, and he just ran off from the battlefield at that point, knowing that because of what was going on, he was in a really vulnerable position, right? So he runs off. The python is chasing him. Now, it's important to note, this python is not a Phyrexian, but it is of Phyrexian origin. And by that I mean, it's a summoned beast. The thought was absolutely chilling to Baron. The idea that now the Phyrexians, Carrick specifically, had managed to create a Phyrexian capable of spellcasting. This was a summoned beast, the same way that Teferi or Baron or Urza would summon a beast. The bigger question was, how many? How many of these sorcerers did Carrick have now? Did he have one? Two? Was there an entire army of these time-resistant Phyrexians? Phyrexians bred to endure the rigors of passing through the fast time rift, also augmented with sorceress capabilities? What a terrifying thought. Now, the serpent, the python that was crashing behind him in the forest, that was an immediate danger. But at the same time that Baron's mind was thinking about this immediate danger, another part of it was thinking of the greater danger. This python essentially was symbolic of the greater danger that an army of sorcerers would pose to them. So Baron is just barreling away as fast as he can go. His breath ran ragged. His throat was incredibly raw. He had little cuts and rips on him, but he also felt cold, and that was spurring him on, because the cold was actually the breath of the python, letting him know that it was too close. The feel of its frost breath creeping across his skin, speaking of the doom that was coming for him. So this caused Baron to speed up as much as possible, but also made him more careless, and he ends up tripping and slamming into a tree and falling to the ground, at which point the serpent is able to move towards him, unhinge its massive jaw as Baron's trying desperately to move away. He could see his doom in its mouth. He's scrambling away. All these different thoughts are tumbling through his brain. His mind is desperate to cling on to any spell that could help him. And what actually ended up popping into his mind was a spell that Teferi had just recently shown him. Teferi had come up with a new type of summoning that was useful in one way, but also very unstable. So he ended up summoning up a drake that Teferi had showed him how to phase into being. Instead of coming in the normal way, this drake phased into being. Now this giant beast towered over the python. The python was nothing in comparison to Baron's summon. So the drake darted its head down and tore into the python, lifting it up and arching its neck back so that it could swallow the entire python whole, which admittedly is unfortunate for those two individuals that were trapped inside the python. But at the end of the day, it meant that Baron was safe, if not incredibly shook from the situation. Watching the drake swallow down that python really caused Baron to reflect on what would have happened overall on the Isle of Teleria if he got eaten. He's the headmaster of the Telerian Academy. He's in charge of everything on the island, while Urza is off handling whatever he's doing, right? Like, everything is left to Baron. So if something happened to him, there's nobody who can take over. There's no one to end up summoning Urza back to lead the students and faculty. And in the meantime, more pythons would be coming, right? Again, his thoughts turn to, how many wizards are we up against here? As he's thinking all this, the drake is staring at Baron with one of its cold eyes, and then just as abruptly as it showed up, it phased back out of existence. Baron mused on the flawed nature of Teferi's magic. Now, these beasts that he had learned to summon up, they could pass through time streams, like time rifts and things like that, but their existence was measured in minutes, which is a really, really significant flaw. They have a very disposable nature, right? They serve their purpose and then they're done with. And thinking of beings that had served their purpose and then been discarded by the wayside, that made Baron think of Karn. As Baron's mind turned to thoughts of Karn, he couldn't help but feel saddened thinking about the way things had turned out. Originally, when Karn had been created, Baron had urged Urza to view and treat Karn as if he was his own child. Now, Urza made some steps away from treating Karn like he was just a tool, or so Baron had thought. But then this deal that was made with the Viashino, where Urza agreed to trade Karn away in return for the Viashino's aid, this really cast doubt in Baron's mind whether Urza had made any sort of progress whatsoever. And obviously, this was brutal for Karn, right? He's a giant silver golem with a mind and emotions, complex human-level emotions, and he's just being treated in this callous manner. And unlike physical beings of flesh, he can't actually heal from these wounds the same way. He was never built with the capability to move on emotionally from these sort of events. So Baron's mind is just dark as he's thinking this way. And actually, at that moment, far over in Shiv, Karn was also gloomily thinking about himself. He felt absolutely dead inside. They had been successful. They had come here to get the mana rig operational, and they were right on the cusp of full operation level. So this had been a success, but the closer they got to the success, the more dread built up within inside of Karn. And now he sat outside the mana rig, staring. It had taken them a full year and a half to get here, and he thought about that as the mana rig is just greedily drinking all this lava up into it. At the same time, he almost feels like it's greedily draining his lifeblood, right? His life, in a way, is ending here. He's to be traded to the Viashino in exchange for the use of the mana rig, along with other terms as well. Those don't really matter to Karn, though, right? So these vast steam columns are bursting out of the mana rig. This is a celebratory moment. Along the way, getting here, everyone had kind of found their place. Everybody but Karn. Jhoira was the skilled go-between, right? She would deal with Urza and be a liaison with the Viashino because she could speak roughly their language. Teferi had proven to be an absolutely gifted leader. He had humans and Viashino working together with no problems whatsoever. So he had settled in. Now, Jhoira and Teferi collectively had been placed in charge of making the mana rig operational. And as a result of that, they were forced to work together in close contact. And this was obviously fine with both of them. They're friends. So they happily started growing together. And at this point, Teferi had actually become Jhoira's closest companion. They spent so much time together just due to work. Now, Karn wasn't jealous, right? He understood that humans need that sort of connection. They need to interact with each other in that way. But at the same time, he had his own emotions, and he was lonely. He missed the strolls that they would take and the long conversations. It got to the point where he even started just longing for the days where they were doing guard duty on Teleria. Maybe they didn't interact a lot, but he got to spend way more time with her, right? So you can tell the level of his loneliness, his emptiness at this time. He's not needed as a guard for the mana rig. In fact, he has no purpose at the mana rig other than being a bargaining chip. And at this point, it's been a year and a half, and despite her big words, the Ramadaragaz's mother, the Drake Jeradaragaz, has actually not been spotted. She's no longer hassling the Viashino. The goblins had all seemed to just kind of fade away as well, so there was no problem in that regard. So Karn literally only had one purpose, being traded off like a horse. And to him, it felt like a doom, and it weighed heavily on him. He would be taken away from his friends, everything that he knows, and become just a possession of the Viashino, right? The mana rig was operational. There was no chance now that the deal wouldn't be fulfilled. Everything was going to go forward as planned. Urza had offered him a potential escape, but it wasn't without its risks. So essentially, what Urza had offered to do was to take his emotional affective cortex out of his silver golem body and have a new Thran metal body made for him. So essentially what he would do is he would take one of the golem bodies that are being made out of the Thran metal and just put the emotional affective cortex into this Thran metal man. And that cortex is what caused Karn to come into being, right? Karn's bodies like his body had been created before, but none of them had turned into a thinking, feeling being. It was actually the addition of the Phyrexian Heartstone, which is actually what Karn's matrix is. It's a Phyrexian Heartstone. That's what brought Karn to life. Almost like Frosty the Snowman comes to life with the hat, right? But Karn wasn't sure because Urza said that he could make no promises that his mind and personality would stay intact. So there's no way to know whether the cortex is interacting with something specifically in the silver golem body and all of it together constitutes Karn, or whether it would be a situation where you could just move the cortex and put it in a new body, that's Karn. So there's the entire possibility that what makes up the core of what is Karn could be gone in the transfer. Karn is put in this difficult position of being forced to choose whether he's willing to risk everything that he considers himself to be in a chance to stay with his friends, or whether to keep himself as he knows himself intact, but lose all of his friends and his normal way of life. It is not a nice position to be put in. Nobody would enjoy having to make this sort of a choice. Even as powerful as Urza is, he cannot guarantee what the end result of this would be. So Karn brooded over this as the entire mana rig just glowed out, and basically it glowed really brightly in contrast to the darkness that lurked inside of Karn. More to his mood was actually the sooty fog cloud that started emerging from the smokestacks and settled down around him. He liked that it somewhat cloaked the glow of the mana rig, and it suited his mood, right? Appropriately gloomy, essentially. Karn's life was falling apart outside the mana rig, while inside, new life was being created. The new Thran metal men were being forged starting today. But while Karn sat there, unbeknownst to him, that sooty fog hid something else. Hundreds upon hundreds of goblins, tiny little red eyes, all set on the mana rig as it glowed out a beacon in the darkness. They slowly crept up to the mana rig from every different angle, some of them standing on each other's shoulders to see inside, pulling apart at weak joins in the wall, and slowly but surely they all made their way inside. Karn had no idea, and everyone inside the mana rig was equally oblivious. At the time inside the mana rig, Urza had gathered his best scholars together, Teferi, Karn, Jhoira, all together in his high study. It was essentially a rough approximation of his personal library back on Teleria, except there was one major difference here, and that is that the books here were all Thran books. Only Urza could read the ancient Thran language. These books were useless to everybody else, but he was intent on studying all of them. Now, along the bookshelves, he had plans pinned up. He had a pointer made out of Thran metal. As they were testing the metal's capabilities and creating things, he had a pointer cast for him, and he was using it to gesture towards the schematics that he had pinned up for all of the assembled people. What he had on the paper was a flying machine. Now, this flying machine would be built entirely of Thran metal, every inch of it, and it would have a giant matrix of power stones that filled most of the hull. This would allow enough power to create a magical flying ship that moved faster than sound. And the power from these power stones can be diverted for a number of purposes. One of the most important is to be diverted to weaponry. Jhoira was feeling half bored and impatient, so she blurted out, "What is this even for?" Everyone else in the room was silent. Nobody had wanted to ask Urza what this was all about. Even Urza was surprised that Jhoira had spoken up. You could see it in his face as he turned and looked at her and said, "Isn't it obvious? This is a machine of war. This is designed to destroy Phyrexians." This made Jhoira scowl, but Teferi laid a calming hand on her, so she chose to ignore it and said instead, through gritted teeth, "The metal and power stones that you're using here could be used better. This is a waste. We could build entire armies of the scorpions, the pumas, the runners, all of these sort of things could be created instead of creating one of these devices, right? Why don't we just build gigantic armies?" Now, Urza comes back and says, "Armies are too slow for what we need. This airship is going to be lightning fast. We can use this thing to take out key targets. We're talking about Phyrexian constructs like gigantic, massive dragon engines. These can be laid low by this creation of mine." And Jhoira says, "How many of these dragon engines could there even be?" And Urza says, "Hundreds? Thousands, perhaps?" And Jhoira says, "Well, then shouldn't we build thousands of these ships? If we're going to have to face off against that many dragon engines, shouldn't we have an equal amount of these flying ships?" Now, Urza at this point is getting frustrated. You can see the annoyance on his face, and he says in a clipped tone, "There's not enough power stones on all of Dominaria to build 2 of these and anything else. You literally would need to use everything that we've used to build all the runners, everything else, just to make 2 of these. All the resources on Dominaria could make 2 of these at most with nothing left over." Now, this did nothing to quell Jhoira's skepticism. She says, "You know what? This is a great idea. I understand the appeal of it on the surface, but this isn't realistic. Unless somehow you can come up with more power stones, this is not the best use of power stones. Power stones are one of the most important things that we have access to, and it would squander them to put them all in one central location like this, when spreading them apart will give us a better chance, right? Urza at this point is just getting angrier and angrier, right? He's obsessed with taking down Phyrexia. He doesn't want to accept any delay, and he doesn't understand why other people can't see it the way that he sees it, because sometimes he lets go of the fact that he is a massively powerful planeswalker who's witnessed and experienced all this stuff over hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years. And the rest of the people he's dealing with are short-lived humans that have barely had a taste of Phyrexia. They've seen Carrick, and to them, that's Phyrexia. His rift is Phyrexia. They are but children who have no concept of the real evil that Urza is battling against. And so he's feeling this all build up, and he just tries to vent the frustration in a very human moment by trying to snap the pointer that he was pointing at the ship with on the table. But as we mentioned, that pointer is made out of this Thran metal, so it doesn't snap. It just trembles under his momentous strength and starts gouging into the obsidian counter that he has it pushed down into. And at this point, still not feeling comfortable, Urza just spins around, and out of anger, he tears down the plans for the airship, discards it in the corner, and barks out, "No more delays. I want my Thran metal prototype by month's end." All right, and the meeting ends and everybody leaves. That night, Teferi decided that he wanted to go out and blow off some steam. He also decided it was time to collect on what Jhoira owed him. So he approached Jhoira and said, "It's time for us to explore the forbidden parts of the mana rig. Its secrets await us, and after what happened today and dealing with Urza's outrage, we deserve to have some fun." Now, Jhoira seemed pretty hesitant, right? She put up some half-hearted arguments saying, "Look, we can't go into the Forbidden Zone. We don't want to start a problem with the Viashino," all this sort of thing. But Teferi just overrode her. He wasn't having it. He said, "Tribal law forbids Viashino only. You owe me. You told me that if I got the metalworks fully running with you, that we would then go and explore. And I remember I said it could take years, and you said make it months then, and I did. We got this done that much faster. So you owe me." And at this point, Jhoira just laughs and gives in. She said, "You know what? Okay, you're right. Let's do it." So they decided they were going to make their way to one of the entryways into the forbidden area. Now, it's a rusty old gate, right? Because nobody uses it. The Viashino aren't allowed to enter it. These are their holy lands. Remember that, right? So this is a rusted gate into an area they are not allowed to enter. Keeping an eye out for patrols, they removed the bolts and the gate itself, and the darkness beyond beckoned them. But before they went in, Jhoira actually thought back to the passageway all the way back on the original Teleria at the school, where at one point Teferi had followed her in a similar fashion. And she actually said to him, she's like, "You know, you followed me once, and this feels very, very similar." Teferi smiled at this, said, "Some things never change, even though it felt like a lifetime ago." So guided by the light of some very dim power stones they brought with them, they decided to enter and pass the gate. Now, it turns out the darkness was a crawl space, the kind where a human can barely fit. It's claustrophobic, and crawl space was actually being generous because you couldn't really crawl through. You had to kind of worm your way along. And there were these weird moldings and hooks as they moved along that they just kept kind of banging into and stuff like that. And they weren't sure if anybody was actually even intended to travel down this. Like, what is the purpose of this weird little tunnel that they are worming their way down. And the hooks, they kept catching on their clothing. Teferi is just complaining about them. And Jhoira says, there's gotta be a reason that this place is forbidden. Maybe we shouldn't actually be going down here. And Teferi says, yeah, there's a reason it's forbidden. It's called treasure. So Jhoira responds back, it may be dangerous. Maybe I should have actually had you go first. At which point, Teferi gave no response. The silence was scaring Jhoira, right? Not hearing back from him in this kind of dark, confined area added a level of fear to the scenario, especially right after saying that it might be dangerous. Everybody knows the universe works in ridiculous ways, so saying something like that could just materialize it into reality. I mean, that's not how the world really works, but that is how the human mind works, right? So she's sitting there as that silence kind of stretches out, and then she hears Teferi speak, and there's awe in his voice. He says, these hooks, do you know what they're for? And Jhoira sarcastically, poison darts, some other trap? I'm sure it's nothing good. Teferi says with this awe still in his voice, these are for lamps. These are light sconces. That's what they actually are. And he decides to reach out with his dim Power Stone. Now, as Teferi moved this dim Power Stone closer to the hook sconce on the wall, the Power Stone actually started to glow brighter. And when he placed it fully into the sconce, there was actually this massive burst of light coming from the Power Stone to the point where he had to shy back from the light itself. It took a little bit of time for both of their eyes to slowly adjust to the light being there. And then they realized they were actually not in a crawl space. They were in a hallway. They could clearly see that it had marble floors, walls of riveted metal, and the little sconces ran all the way along in even places, the same way lighting would work in any sort of hallway of this nature. So, obviously, they wondered. Jhoira says, who is this for? The Viashino are way too big for this. This is made for small, like tiny people. And Teferi comes back with, well, the Thran? Maybe the Thran were tiny people. Jhoira says, wait, no, that's not possible. Weren't you paying attention during our lessons? Think back to like the original days of the Master. Urza and Mishra found an ornithopter at a Thran site, and it was human-sized. There's no way the Thran are like tiny people. That's not possible. So Teferi says, other than the Thran made it? And Jhoira looked around and said, no, this definitely is built like everything else here. This is definitely of Thran construction, but it's constructed by the Thran for other servant beings, perhaps? Maybe that's what this is? Not 100% clear on that, but either way, there's a door up ahead. And Teferi at this point is now the one feeling cautious. And he says, be careful. Whoever these small beings are, they may still be here. And he pulls down his Power Stone off of the wall, and darkness engulfs them again. They deal with another period of having to wait for their eyes to adjust while they slowly inch forwards, reaching towards a doorway where there was this hot, dry air coming from some source. They don't know where. And they basically stick a Power Stone ahead to look in there, and it's a bunch of pipes and conduits. Now, some of those conduits are faintly glowing from the heat of having lava passed through them. So that's where the hot, dry air is coming from. It's the lava that's being sucked up by the mana rig. Now, previously, Jhoira had talked about how the mana rig had enough power to power 50 furnaces. Why are there only 5 furnaces, right? Where is the rest of this power going? So this location showed them this is where the extra power is being drawn to. This lava is flowing into the Forbidden Zone to power it. So what's going on here? Because when you look at everything, Jhoira basically started to kind of map it out in her mind, right? Because they had worked on this for so long, she could visualize in her head where everything kind of is in terms of the pipes and conduits and how things work. So she figured it out. Wait, 70% of all of the tubes inside of the mana rig are all unaccounted for and are all leading to this Forbidden Zone, feeding it power. Jhoira mused out loud, what needs that much power? And Teferi chimed in, something to do perhaps with mutagenics? Now, Jhoira was doubtful. She explained to Teferi, that doesn't actually make sense to me. Mutagenics actually have more to do with taking the power inside a being and changing it around. And you'd normally do that with things like vats and chemicals, as opposed to the raw power that's being pulled from this lava. And Teferi looked genuinely impressed. He's like, well, it looks like you paid attention to the lessons we were taught. As they moved past the doorway filled with the conduits sending the lava into the Forbidden Zone, they started to feel cool, dank air on their faces. And this meant that there was a bigger room ahead. And as they went, the passage bent around the corner and widened into a pair of open doors. Now inside, there was only coldness and echoes. This was a giant room that was too big to light with either of the feeble power stones. Now Teferi's power stone was shining a bit brighter after being placed in the sconce, so instead of randomly blindly stumbling around the room, they decided to have Teferi go to one of the walls, find one of these sconces, and he did so, placing his power stone into it, at which point it lit up the room enough that Jhoira was able to go to the opposite side of the room and set her stone there, and as a result, it lit up the entirety of the room. Now, the most noticeable thing at first is that there were pipes and valves absolutely everywhere. They were converging into a gigantic mass, a thicket in the center of the room, where inside the center of this mass of pipes and all that, you couldn't see what was actually located inside of all of these different pipes and valves. What is this? Teferi says. And Jhoira goes, you know what? You could actually be right. This could be a mutagenic vat. They could have been doing mutagenic experiments here. Why don't we take a look? So they traveled forwards through the massive amount of dust that was everywhere. And Jhoira noticed this and said to Teferi, this place truly has been empty for a long, long time. And Teferi says that's not the case, actually. This place is unused, yes, but not empty. And then he points out that there's a handprint in the dust. And he says, I think what happened was someone was watching us. Someone was here in the room watching us, and they ran away when we put these lights in the sconces there. When those power stones lit up the room, I believe that they just took off. Now, this made Jhoira fearful. She felt very concerned and said, you know, we've gathered enough information here. We should probably at this point return and report all of this information to Urza. Now, Teferi ignored that. He wanted nothing to do with that. He was going to have an adventure regardless of what Jhoira was thinking. He had to know what was in the center of all these pipes. Why let somebody else come back with the discovery when he could find it himself? So he spoke up when he noticed that there's actually, hey, there's a porthole here in the main mechanism, and he rushed towards it, obliterating the tracks in the dust of whoever it was that had ran off when they showed up. And Jhoira followed after him, her curiosity getting the better of her. Now, there was a cake of centuries worth of dust on this little port glass window into this mechanism. So they wiped it away and light burst out from inside. Now, Jhoira was fundamentally unprepared for what she saw. She uttered a phrase, by the stones of Koilos. That was a really appropriate phrase to be using. The stones of Koilos, those are actually the gemstone eyes of Urza, right? But before that, it was one giant solid power stone, okay? And it was used to keep the door to Phyrexia shut. There was a portal between Dominaria and Phyrexia, so Urza's homeworld and Phyrexia. That stone served as a way of keeping the door locked. That stone got broken apart, and just the power of that stone itself, broken into two pieces, caused the entire war between Mishra and Urza. And inside this porthole, when she looked through, she could see a power stone that was just as big as the unbroken stone. And this was a perfect, unblemished power stone, the same size as the original power stone that turned Urza into the planeswalker that he is, essentially, right? So at this point, she's staring, just absolutely stunned by this power stone. Surrounding that giant power stone were hundreds and hundreds of fist-sized power stones. Any single one of those power stones could power an entire dragon engine. Jhoira was blown away, and Teferi was also awed. He couldn't believe it. No wonder this place is forbidden, he said. It's literally a power stone trove. Like, this is a treasure trove of power stones. And Jhoira realized Teferi had not grasped the full reality of where they were and what this was. This isn't a power stone charging location. This isn't a trove location where they're just keeping power stones. This device makes power stones. As this great revelation settled over Teferi, Jhoira realized she could feel a presence in the room, and they weren't alone. So she cried out to Teferi, "Teferi, we're not alone." And he turns and quickly tries to cast an enchantment, but he's not fast enough, and nets descend on him and Jhoira, pulling tight as the lights in the room are snuffed out. All right, my friends, that was a very intense installment of the story. If you want to know what's going to happen next with Jhoira and Teferi, make sure you're here next Sunday, or if you just can't wait, jump on the Patreon for early access, and you don't even have to wait fully until next Sunday. And on top of that, you get to support what I'm doing here, because I'll be honest, YouTube ad revenue is not very good, so we rely on Patreon to try and make this into a full-time, full-scale project. So if you really like what I'm doing here, consider supporting me on Patreon and helping me make this into a gigantic, sprawling project where we tell all of Magic's stories. Thanks for being here, my friends. I will see you next Sunday, and remember, lore is life.